I was really debating whether or not to put this video up because it shows an actual portfolio walkthrough that I did with a company that I was interviewing with. And I've decided to upload it, but I've had to edit it to remove the audio in a lot of places because I didn't want to, one, reveal company information, but two, I didn't want, because it was an actual client project that I worked on, I didn't want to, give away information, too much information about what the product was. So I'm still uploading this video, but just know that the audio was going to be cut at various places that I felt disclosed too much information. So I hope you still get something out of this and just seeing how I communicate. I mean, I'm not like an expert in this, but if you just sort of wanted a view on what a portfolio walkthrough looks like, as well as what hiring managers will often ask at the end of a portfolio walkthrough, or at least a couple questions they asked me, maybe that might be helpful for you. So I hope you enjoy this. So are you able to see my screen okay?
Yes.
Should say no on it. Is that what you're seeing?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so I feel like this would be a pretty cool project to talk about, just because so really what this is a mobile app that I worked on as part of a team. And the whole goal with this app is to be able to help users So I think about it kind of like Yelp, but instead of finding restaurants, you're finding Wi-Fi hotspots, and there's this sort of reward component for. And so this was something that I did as a contract UX designer. And so the client came to us, and he just had some scrappy mock-ups that he had, but really he wanted to allow people to be able to easily set up one of the things that he wanted to develop was also hardware down the line. And so he wanted people to be able to set up, as well as being able to find the Wi-Fi hotspots in a neighboring area like I talked about. And then he wanted to integrate this with, and that's really how, if they shared their Wi-Fi connection. So really the main things that I figured we needed to focus on as a team were to find the easiest way to allow users to be able to locate and connect to free Wi-Fi. And then when it comes to setting up which they call, I might use the terms interchangeably, but they mean the same thing. So to be able to provide the most seamless experience for people to be able to do that, and then thinking about it from a business perspective and how they can monetize, integrating a freemium upgrade option to allow for increased functionality for people who have. Now there is something, and I'll kind of dive into this a little bit later, but we had sort of a tight deadline with this project. It was a 5-week sprint, and so we were unable to integrate the element, and I'll kind of talk about that a little bit more. Yeah, so for this role, or for this project, I was designated as the lead designer for this role. So basically how that works is with the agency that I was a part of, you can submit your name to be potentially chosen to be a lead designer, just depending on who's interested. And then they'll just select who they feel like would be the best for that. And so really my main responsibilities, aside from the typical UX UI design responsibilities, were to be able to organize meetings, making sure that we're keeping track with our deadlines, and also being the point of contact, or having a point of contact between, basically just having communication between the client to make sure we had some goal alignment. And so this was a 5-week sprint. I will say it did take us 5.5 weeks, and again, that was kind of due to us being unable to integrate. Again, I'll kind of talk about that little obstacle as we go through here. But really for this process, we really tried to integrate some research in the sense of competitive analysis. We had some ideating in terms of having user flows to accomplish the user stories that were define the scope of this project, as well as working on wireframes, high fidelity screens, and then we weren't able to collaborate with developers in real time. So we developed a handoff for them to try to make it as seamless as possible for them to be able to develop. Before I move on, do you have any questions about any of this so far? Is there anything kind of like more in particular you want me to focus on, or you want me to kind of give you just kind of a good run through of this?
Yeah. Kind of good run through, I think, and then we can still communicate something we want to like.
Yeah. Okay, that sounds good to me. Okay, so I'll get to the high fidelity screens a little bit later. So really for the research aspect, so I organized a kickoff meeting, and really the whole goal for this was to just get alignment on what our goals were to do for the project. So really there was a project brief where the client had listed out what he would want the app to be able to do, but we really just wanted to gain clarity to make sure we were all on the same page. So we organized a Google Doc, and we just sort of laid out questions that we felt would gain some clarity to the project. And so some of these you can see listed here. And so really the main things that I felt like we gleaned from this is that became important during the design process is knowing that there's actually two main target audiences. So there's people seeking Wi-Fi, but also people who just want to set up their proprietary. The client was really adamant about wanting the Wi-Fi finding to be very similar to how Google Maps sort of uses their UI for their map, and he wanted that to be a prominent feature for people to use. And the third component, which actually is, again, going to be important for something I talk about later, is that we wanted clarification on because again, this is hardware that the client doesn't even have yet. So trying to figure out what would that setup process entail, and if someone actually needs to be able to have some sort of is that required in order to set up and so we learned that that was not necessary, and that actually became very important as we go through here. So after that, we had to figure out, it was important for us to figure out what other companies are doing something similar to this, and what things seem to be working well that we could potentially take inspiration from. And so a couple of the companies were, so both of those are companies that specialize in a pretty similar concept of offering Wi-Fi, but and we also took inspiration from really from the standpoint of they have a very easy, seamless setup process for their. And so because we didn't have a concrete setup process for them, we took some inspiration from them, at least as a way to at least present something to the client as far as that flow would go. But some other takeaways that I had from our competitive analysis is that for a lot of these apps, blue seems to be the most commonly color used in this sort of based app. Dark mode is often the default for these apps. However, the client actually wanted light mode as the default as opposed to dark mode. And so we actually went with that because we didn't think it would really affect the user experience to that much of a degree. That seemed to be just more of a cosmetic design decision more than anything. And so the other thing, and I kind of talked about this, but just making sure that the having the setup process, having one screen dedicated to each step, and that would probably make it a more seamless process for someone when they're wanting to set up. And then we also learned from these apps and kind of looking at their flows that is a very complicated process that requires a lot of setting up a, as well as setting up this complex passphrase verification step process. So we were able to learn more about how typically integrated in these. Okay, so then comes the sort of the ideating phase. And so these user stories were defined for us to sort of define the scope of this 5-week sprint that we were doing. And so the primary things that we were responsible for was having a user be able to sign in, create an account, to be able to find the free Wi-Fi using the map feature, to be able to set up and then to be able to unlock the freemium features that I talked about in the beginning there. And so that kind of sets up the scope of our project. And so user flows is really where we start to dig into that obstacle that I've sort of been leading up to for a lot of this project. And so really the main thing that we needed, well, truthfully, further clarification on is the setting up of a Wi-Fi. And so once we kind of started digging into that competitive analysis and realizing that if we wanted to integrate to this project, it's going to require an extensive amount of screen design. And so I think, well, what we ended up doing is we kind of came together as a group and talked about is that something that we felt like was feasible to do and we can still maintain quality within the time frame that we had. And so really we came to the conclusion that we didn't think that that was possible, just given the fact that we also had the other user stories to address. So I met with the client through a video call and just sort of talked about our concerns and about how we probably wouldn't be able to integrate them, but we could still fulfill the user story and being able to set up. And so the client was amenable to that decision. And I think just being able to be, just have that transparency, but giving a reasoning why it wouldn't be possible. And again, just sort of focusing on the fact that we wanted to create something that was high quality to ultimately deliver. And if we had to integrate this, there might be a chance where we wouldn't have been able to deliver such a high quality product to the client. And so needless to say, we were able to tailor our user flow for the setting up of to just be that process as opposed to integrating. So we had to, so that was something that would be pushed to a future sprint there. And so then we started going through we started coming up with wireframes for each of the user stories. And so the main thing, we wanted to be efficient, but we also wanted to maintain some sort of quality control and consistency. And so we used a unified wireframing kit. So we would be using all of the same icons, components, typography would be similar. And so that way, each of us could work on a respective flow, but still have some degree of consistency so that we could present that to the client for feedback. And so for me, I worked predominantly on the settings menu as well as the freemium upgrade. The settings was challenging for me personally, just because there's a lot of just very custom technical settings that I had to figure out. And so some of this came from conversations with the client, but also just looking into other similar apps and how they set up their information architecture when it comes to a settings menu. And so that was something where I definitely had to do a little bit of research on. but we were able to complete those wireframes, send them to the client, and then ultimately we wanted to transition this into high fidelity, but we didn't want to go through and just try to design the entire product. What we did instead is just we picked what's the most important screen to design, and let's come up with some mock-ups for that so that we can present those to the client. And so that's really what we did here. So we have 3 different varieties of the home screen, and the way I felt like worked pretty well is we each designed so there was 5 people on our team, and so each of us designed what we thought would be an ideal setup for what the home screen would entail. And so once we did that, we kind of came together and we talked about, well, we don't want to send all 5, so we want to come up with the best 3. So we took it to a vote, and so these were sort of the top 3 that we decided to deliver to the client. And we also wanted to make sure that there was enough variety between the 3 so that the client actually had some variety to pick from. So for example, having mostly UI differences, so having squared off nav bar versus having a rounded corner nav bar, having some variety in how the markers are displayed, as well as some color variety in the map icon, the buttons there, and even including like a card section here. So we wanted just some variety just to get a sense of what the client was looking for. In an ideal world, I would have liked to have been able to user test some of these to see what actual users would think about some of these. But in this instance, for time constraints, we had to rely on sort of the client's direction on where he wanted to go. And so ultimately, he chose the middle one. This happened to be the one that I designed. And really, to go over just a couple of design reasonings that I chose for this. As far as the icons, I wanted them to be, large, easy to see. So I made something that was very high contrast that could be easily noticed on the map screen. The nav bar, I noticed that a lot of apps in a similar space tend to use just pill-shaped nav bars and all rounded icons. So that's what I did for a lot of the UI there. And then thinking about things from a monetization aspect, thinking about how can I maybe introduce some paid markers, so having little ad markers here that companies could potentially pay for, and that could be a stream of revenue for the company. So the final design for this isn't the final design. I'll talk about that once I get to it. It's sort of an amalgamation of the 3 that I have here. And so once we kind of had this, at least as a framework for what we felt the UI should look like, then it was really coming down to creating a style guide that we could work off. And so really, again, the main purpose that we designed this first was so that we could have just sort of these unified components that we could use for our high fidelity screens. So figuring out what icon set we're using, what color palette that we're going to use, as well as just figuring out what some of these components are going to look like and having some consistency between them so that we can easily just use these in our high fidelity screens going forward. And so that takes us to the high fidelity screen. So again, each of us kind of worked on our respective user flows, developing or designing the high fidelity screens with the style guide that we had created. And so if we go to, I wanted to just sort of highlight the differences in the home screen here. So really the main difference with this home screen versus the one before is most of these were based off of client preference. Again, user testing probably would have been best for this, but we were unable to do that during the sprint. So he really liked that design that I mentioned before, but he liked the card feature that was present on this third design here. And so really what that card would be displaying is just sort of a list view of what some of these icons are representing. And then he also wanted more of sort of the squared off nav bar as well. So that's pretty much what we implemented there. And then again, just using the style guide, we just tried to make a very unified looking app experience for the user, for them to be able to accomplish whatever flow they're trying to accomplish. And so, like I said before, we weren't able to collaborate with developers in the project. So part of the way that we tried to make this easy to develop is we tried to use auto layout as much as possible. I figured that if we try to do that, then anything that we're able to design in auto layout at least should be able to be feasibly developed in CSS. And so that's something that we really tried to be cognizant of. But as far as the actual handoffs themselves, we just tried to make annotations for each of the screens, just talking about where, if any, basically anything that was ambiguous, we tried to make it as clear as possible. So, like for example, like where does this actually take you if you hit this, if you hit the sign out? Just having some spacing measurements here, just to give developers, just so they don't have to always peek at the Figma coding element. They can sort of just see on the screen here, but also just looking at different, if there's like an interaction state that's confusing. Like for example, we had this marker here, and so we want it to be clear that, hey, that's really something that's designed to grab attention to the user's eye. That's not necessarily means it's a selected state or anything like that. And so we just tried to be clear with anything that was ambiguous and to make it clear to them so that there could be ease when it came to handoff in that regard. And so really looking back at this project, I think the one thing that I think we did well in this project was really our ability to communicate and collaborate as a team. Again, we really ran into some difficulties when it came to the scope of this project as it pertained to setting up the and if we were able to integrate. But I think just being able to have those conversations with the team and be realistic about, is this something that we feel that we can pull off, but also maintain quality with being able to do so. And so again, or kind of in relation to that, also just again being transparent with the client as well. And so presenting sort of what is the obstacle that we are running into and what we feel like would be the best decision to still achieve the goal of the user story, but also maintain quality by not having to work on or not focus on the. Now, the way we could have improved this project, however, is we probably could have caught that scope obstacle earlier. And that's partly why this project lasted half a week longer than it needed to, is I think we just caught it a little bit later than we should have, because we had already worked a little bit on some sketching and potential ways that we might be able to integrate. And I think if we would have caught that a little bit earlier, we would have been able to meet the deadline as originally set out. But overall, the client really seemed to like the project. He gave a really good testimonial about the work that we provided, which was really, really great to see. And yeah, that's sort of this project that I worked on. Project. Any questions on this, or anything you want me to kind of dive into a little more detail with?
Yeah, a couple of questions. You mentioned that your primary responsibility was the sitting table. What was the working model of the team? Like, how many people did you work with, and who were the people?
So yeah, so we had 5 members, 5 designers on the team. We had a project manager, and then the client was just he's just the CEO. It's a startup company, so he's the only one at this moment. So he was really the only one we were getting feedback from as far as that goes.
And was there any specific metrics that you like determine success? You said he wrote like a testimonial saying how he wrote it, but was there any like data or health that you were striving for as you were moving?
So for this, because it was so early in his startup phase, we didn't really have our main metric was really to accomplish all of the user stories within the deadline that we had presented. Because I think really the hard thing is that we weren't able to user test this, so we didn't really have any data to work off of, and we didn't really have any data that we were collecting. And so other than gaining client feedback and if this is the direction that he's looking to go with the product, we didn't really have any concrete metrics we were able to work off of.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, sure.